All right, as we follow up on our DC Universe Classics director's commentary, we're going to have to talk about our Comic Con. This is not Swamp Thing. No, this is Man Thing. All right, there we go. Swamp Thing, right? You recognize him because he's always carrying around beautiful babes, and that's not even close. That's not Swamp Thing either. Yeah, all right. So there's a lot of swampy kind of characters in comic book culture. There we go. There we are. There's Alec. There's Swamp Thing. Okay. So DC's Swamp Thing was our Comic-Con San Diego exclusive Matty collector item for 2011. And a lot went into this figure. This was actually a very unique figure. And he's got a very unique heritage, especially when it comes to toys and the comics at that. He's been both proper DC, he's been Vertigo, he's had a couple movies, some funnier than others, some more serious. Again, always, walking around the swamp with a beautiful woman in his arms, because that's what he does in the movies, I guess. Some of the movies were hokier than others. And he's had a history of toys, because Swamp Thing had a cartoon show and a toy line in the 80s, which is very interesting because, again, he's kind of like an obscure DC character, but he got kind of promoted to full-on toy line. And even Mattel is no stranger to doing kind of swampy characters. I mean, we've got Moss Man and Leech from the Masters of the Universe Classics line, so hey, it was now time to take all of that swampy knowledge and apply it to the DC universe. And this wouldn't be our only Swamp Thing figure, our being Mattel. I mean, I'm not with Mattel anymore, but I guess they are only. Swamp Thing has shown up in many of Mattel's lines, including Imaginext with a kind of, I love Batman with his swamp boots. I mean, come on, that's awesome. As well as a awesome Swamp Thing figure in the Justice line, which works perfectly with JLU, by the way. If you can track down this figure, it's a great figure to put with your Justice League Unlimited figures, because it's kind of animation-y. And then, of course, who can forget the Swamp Thing Hot Wheels, Dune Buggy, Swamp Vehicle-y thing. I do love the way Hot Wheels can reimagine what characters would be like if they were cars, because, that's what toys are all about, and they're fun. Obviously, other companies have been in on the Swamp Thing fun as well. Funko Pop has done actually quite a few Swamp Things. They even did a flocked one. I wonder if they got that idea from Moss Man. I wonder if we should sue them over that. Probably not. I don't think we can own Flock. And as I noted, Swamp Thing had his own toy line back in the day with lots and lots of variants of Swampy. Him closer to a tree, closer to slime goo, closer to, I don't know, just looking like he just woke up and rose out of the marsh, I guess. I don't know. But it was an awesome toy line, and it had some play sets, it had some vehicles, it had like experimentation matrices, and all sorts of cool stuff. You just don't get enough Venus flytrap toys, do you, these days? I mean, that's just a great feature on a playset. And of course, anytime, you can strap characters down in a laboratory and start experimenting on them in a toy line, I think only like this and Ghostbusters. This might even be like the same tool, I wonder, is from the Ghostbusters. I'll have to look at that. It wasn't just Swamp Thing in the line. Some of the Unmen and some of the other secondary characters from the show showed up in the line as well. Obviously, but Swamp Thing was the main star, and you could get your traditional version of him as well as pretty much any kind of deco variant that they could squeeze out. It was kind of like almost like what Batman was doing years later. And of course, anyone who fights in the swamp, there's going to be a Bayou Jack, right? I mean, come on. That name is just like so toy. I'm Bayou Jack. Where do you live? I live in the Bayou, and my name's Jack. It's like I'm House Scott. That's what I should start telling people. I do like the tree one, though. That was a pretty cool, awesome Swamp Thing. Because, how many deco variants can you really get out of Swamp Thing? I mean, I know they call this one Camouflage Swamp Thing, like he's supposed to be disguised as a tree or something. I don't know. I feel like he's going to say, like, his name is Groot or something, or go hang out on Middle-earth. Swamp Thing actually also had a figure proposed for superpowers in one of the final waves. He never made it, but he was sculpted, and they did look into releasing him. It just never happened, like most toy lines ending before their time. DC Direct, of course, has done their fair share of Swamp Thing figures. Some of them after hours, some of them before. This one was based on the New 52, and he suddenly grew horns and angel wings because reasons. But, he translates really well to an adult collector figure as well, with articulation and, ball joints and all that, which we're going to get into in a moment because Mattel's Swamp Thing was a little different when you came to articulation. Now, we did look at all the different iterations, both toy and live action, all of the different ways Swamp Thing was brought to the screen and in the comics and to the toy aisle, because we pretty much knew we had one shot at doing Swamp Thing and wanted to get him right. He's a character that is recognized by a lot more than just the regular sort of comic fan at pop culture, because, again, all of the entertainment he had in the 80s, he has sort of penetrated through that pop culture veil where people will know who he is, although they may still confuse him with Man-Thing or some of those other swampy characters. So we definitely wanted to do justice to Swamp Thing. We wanted to make sure we made him into a really great figure, because hopefully he was going to appeal beyond just the standard DCU classic fan. So our Comic-Con offering was super deluxe. You got a figure, you got a base, you got a mask, you got a package, you got the Unmen. Yeah, we'll get into that. So Swampy stood pretty tall. He was actually bigger than some of the Build-A-Figures. Build-A-Figures? Collect and Connect, excuse me. Trademark and copyright. Standing way bigger than a regular figure. I mean, Batman barely comes up to, like his navel or his abs? So, yeah, I mean, he was a big guy, and, he stood well above some of the other figures that kind of were Vertigo-ish. Not totally. It's weird how Swamp Thing went from, like, Vertigo to DC to back to Vertigo. It's like, make up your mind, find a universe, and stick with it, and be part of it, because you're confusing all the kids out there. So, in a lot of ways, Swamp Thing was very much a experiment for us. Meaning he was kind of the guinea pig. You see, at the same time as Swamp Thing, the design team was working on the Dark Knight Rises line, which was going to be a major retail line, and they wanted to do something innovative. So they came up with this idea of doing a character that became Stealth Fusion Batman for the adult collector. This was sold on Matty. And this was going to be a Batman figure without any visible joints. He was basically going to be wearing a suit over a skeleton body, so you could articulate him, but you wouldn't see any of the articulation points. And the idea was, if this caught on, it could be a whole new way of doing action figures at Mattel, and maybe revolutionize the entire toy industry. Who knows? Well, it didn't quite catch on to expectations. The figure didn't sell quite as well as Mattel had hoped it would, but it was still a really cool Batman. And, again, you could pose him in all these cool ways. He was super posable, but because the articulation was done from an internal skeleton system with a rubber suit wrapped around it, you didn't see any of the pins, any of the joints. It looked more like a natural flowing actor or person. And to get to this point, Swamp Thing was the guinea pig. So Design wanted to make sure they could pull this off, and decided that Swamp Thing was going to be the experiment using this same technology and same articulation style, with the internal structure wrapped around with swampy goodness, which actually did work well, because Swamp Thing, does have kind of like this, a swampy skin that flows over him. Of course, he would have worked as an articulated figure, but Design wanted to make sure they got Batman right, because that's where the money is, Batman, no offense to Swamp Thing. And it did allow them, though, to add a huge amount of detail that wouldn't have worked if it was a regular articulated figure, because all of those veins and pods and mushrooms that the Horseman lovingly sculpted could be captured exactly like that without having to break up anything with joints. So for a figure that was going to be a test subject for this new articulation system, it actually worked rather well. He was sort of a good, if someone had to be, sort of the guinea pig, Swamp Thing worked well for this. I know a lot of fans felt that he stood out because, unlike all the rest of DCU classics, he didn't have regular articulation. But, I still think it worked really well, and I love the way the rubber feels and works. His packaging was also kind of super deluxe, but at the same time, very environmentally conscious, because, Swamp Thing. So he started off in a shipper box. On the front was kind of like a crate with air holes, I guess, because, toys need to breathe. And then on the back, you got a little bio as well as a message from Mattel that this was an environmentally safe, recycled package, etc. Because, environmental superheroes saving the earth is important, and there's not too many of them out there, and Swamp Thing is one of them that has a very earth-friendly message to him. So there you go. Swamp Thing was not just a guinea pig as far as articulation, but also as far as environmentally friendly packaging. Hey, cool. So when you crack open the box, you'd pull out this, which was a Swamp Thing mask, but it was made of kind of like egg crate material. So it was like a pre-recycled, very easy to recycle material, brown, but it was, done in green. And you would crack that open, and inside of the mask was Swamp Thing with his base and a little booklet explaining, it was kind of like a dossier on like Swamp Thing sightings, or I can't totally remember. I don't have the booklet on hand. I'd have to dig it up out of my DCU chest. But it was cool, and it was a way of making him, a bit super deluxe, and the way the eyes were in the mask lined up perfectly with the red of the inner foam there, because that would shine through the eyes of the mask when it was closed. Or you could wear the mask yourself. Now, like previous Mattel San Diego Comic-Con exclusives for the DCU line, management was very adamant about including something that made it special just for the show. Because now that we could sell items on Matty Collector, you could get your Comic-Con items direct. You didn't have to go to the show like you did with Keldor or She-Ra. So like Gleek and Plastic Man's suitcase for the 75th anniversary of DC, Swamp Thing got an added bonus just at the show, which was the Unmen, which are kind of genetically created little monster squibby things, brain guys and snake guys. And I will absolutely confess, I was not fully aware of the Unmen until we started working on this. Bill Beneke, huge fan, knew exactly who they were and how to do them. This was 100% Bill's idea. So Bill gets major kudos. For those of you who don't know who the Unmen are, and that included me at a time, they are sort of enemies / frenemies of Swamp Thing. They've helped him out. They've also attacked him. They work for Arcane, who's one of his bad guys, who used to be like a Nazi scientist, and he did all this kind of experimentation, and one of the things he created were these little kind of swampy monsters, and they would attack Swamp Thing, and they were usually pretty inept at doing that, and their intelligence level was not exactly stellar, so Swamp Thing would usually get the best of them. But Bill was a huge Unman fan. He loved them, and the idea of including them with Swamp Thing as the San Diego Comic-Con only bonus was a great way of doing it, because that way you got Swamp Thing, and if you were at the show, you got the Unmen, and if you weren't at the show, then you didn't get the Unmen, and it made it special for the show, with Matty Collector now being an option that didn't exist in previous years when you had to go to the show. Now, the Unmen were also in the animated series. They were a little bit more humanoid, kind of revised as bad guy thugs for the show and for the toy line. But, we did them more traditional to the comic book look. So whether, however you loved your Swamp Thing, whether he was, this guy stalking through the swamp with a beautiful woman in his arms, because that's how he was in all of the entertainment, it seems, or you were a fan of the comic books, or you were just a fan of the vintage toy line, or even the new live action that seems to be, slightly struggling these days. Now he's just carrying around like corpses instead of beautiful women. So maybe that's, because everyone's into zombies these days because of, zombie. Well, Swamp Thing was awesome, and it was a saga bringing him out, and the new experimental articulation, it worked. And while it didn't sell a million Batmans, it did make Swamp Thing stand out as a very unique figure in the line. And he was one of the few DCU Classics characters that actually had a base, too, which really did make him super deluxe. It made him even taller when he was standing on the base. He kind of towers over everybody. So that's Swampy, the last Comic-Con DC item I worked on. I was done at this point and ready to pass the brand on. So we'll get more into that next time.